you know, we get told time and again, look, it's all very well you middle-class white people telling us what the problem is, right? You're not middle-class and you're not white. What is the problem and how do we deal with this?
Well, as I've said many times before, the social indicators, I don't say causes because obviously there's still an element of personal responsibility. The social indicators for violent crime among young working-class street gangs have remained consistent for 200 years. Relative poverty, masculinity, exposure to domestic violence, lack of education. So the solutions are fairly obvious in many ways. Glasgow, which was once dubbed the most violent city in Europe, still has a higher murder rate than London. But when we look at serious youth violence, which is my preferred term, if journalists want to be taken more seriously, they should use the term serious youth violence because knife crime has become a sort of racial buzzword at the moment. Glasgow has seen a dramatic reduction in serious youth violence to the point that none of the murders of teenagers that occurred in 2017 occurred in Scotland. What approaches did they take in Glasgow? They took a public health approach, they took an interagency approach, they took an approach that saw violence in a holistic way. They saw the link between domestic violence and violence in the street. They saw the link between violence in society in general and violence in the street. They looked at early interventions, basically, coming into young people's lives and families' lives as early as possible and diverting them away from crime. Good education, good jobs, counselling. That was so dramatically effective. So the fact that there's all this hand-wringing and suggestion that an entirely different set of policies should be suggested for London, maybe Birmingham and Manchester.
So let me put this to you.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting,
Yeah.
your view of this. And what I would say to you is this. Statistically, it looks like in London right now, this is predominantly a problem of young black teenage boys who are members almost exclusively of gangs attacking each other, so that the perpetrators and the victims appear to be almost exclusively young black men. Do you think there is a racial element to that in terms of any cultural issues, racial issues? Or do you think it's the same problem they had in Glasgow, where they were white, but actually the race part of this is something that we might look at the statistics and think it's a black problem when it's not?
OK, so there are several regions of the country, let's just look at the facts, that have higher murder rates than London does. Clearly, throughout human history, black people have not had anything remotely resembling a monopoly on violence. Over the last few years, some of the most horrendous knife attacks, both the victims and the perpetrators have been white and they've not been from London, including a 13-year-old girl stabbed to death in Southampton, a 16-year-old stabbed to death in Dinnington, a 7-year-old girl stabbed to death in York, a 5-year-old stabbed to death by its own mother in Oxfordshire. When both the perpetrator and the victims are white, race suddenly becomes unimportant. There is one limited sense in which race may be important. You could argue that only a very particular demographic of young black boys, only at a very particular stage in their lives, feel a degree of psychological self-hatred or contempt for themselves that they project onto other people who most remind them of themselves. However, the black-on-black violence paradigm, so-called, is never used in that way as a kind of psychological self-hatred model. It's used to give the public essentially the ridiculous impression that black school teachers, black doctors, black lawyers, black Premier League footballers, my grandmother, David Adjaye, Oswald Boateng, are all sort of an equal risk of violent crime. And actually,
well, it reminds me a little bit. I mean, it's different, but it's interwoven slightly into what happened in New Zealand, where you have this white supremacist committing an act of horror. Had he been an ISIS terrorist, the immediate reaction from many people would have been, this is a Muslim problem. Because he's a white supremacist, I've not heard people say, this is a white person problem.
Well, precisely. We have enough trouble getting what I'm going to call the racial virtue signalling right-wing press to call white supremacist terrorists by their proper name, let alone to force all white people to explain the bad actions of all other white people. For example, you will never be called upon to explain that not all middle-aged white men are paedophiles, despite the fact that hundreds, maybe thousands of them are convicted of sex offences every year, because it's self-evident that not all middle-aged white men are paedophiles.
I think it's a completely valid point, I do.
Let's look at it in the other sense. Where young black boys overachieve is race offered as an explanatory factor. For example, British, Ghanaian and Nigerian boys on free school meals, so the poorest sector, academically outperform and are more likely to go to university than similarly poor white, mixed race and black English kids whose grandparents came from the Caribbean. The 4 youngest children in Britain to ever take GCSEs are all black. Romari Wilfred, a young black boy from East London, has a higher IQ than Einstein. Young black men are more disproportionately represented in professional football than any other area of British life, with all of the consequences and implications that has for their contribution to the tax base, etc. So it's almost as if a black person does something negative, the entire so-called black community is to blame. Black person does something positive and they suddenly regain their humanity and their right to be viewed as an individual. What I'm saying is I'm not just talking about what I read in sociology books, I'm talking about what I saw in my real life.
But here's a tough question for you.
Last point about London, sorry. In the last 2 years, it's still important to remember that the overwhelming majority of murders have not been committed by teenage black boys. So, for example, in 2017, There were 117 or 16 murders, 21 of which were of teenage black boys. In 2018, there were 134. 24 were of teenagers in general. So it's also important
so the stats can be twisted any way you like.
Precisely.
However, let me throw this back at you.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding all that, and I think it's fascinating what you've been saying, notwithstanding all that, there is no doubt that right now the knife crime element of murder in London is predominantly young black teenage boys. Yeah. And so my question for you is there any racial or cultural element to what is going on relating to knife crime in young black teenage boys?
Listen to what you've just said. When you think that blackness is the most important thing to emphasise about these young men, almost half of the young people in prison in Britain, regardless of ethnicity, were in care as children. Almost half of young people in prison in Britain were expelled from school as children. When we offer blackness as an explanatory factor, as if we don't need to know anything else...
Is it irrelevant, though, Akala?
No.
Is it irrelevant?
As I said at the top of the programme, or a couple of minutes ago, in the one limited sense in which it may be relevant, i.e. the idea of a kind of particular psychological self-hatred that affects only a very particular group of young black boys and men, and then only at a very particular stage in their life.
What is that? Explore that for a moment.
So I'm saying there is an internalised racism, essentially. And you hear this in some rap music in some senses, you see it in some people's behaviours, where basically contempt for black life, only a very particular group of young black boys at a very particular stage...
react against it.
Perhaps internalise that. But we never use it in that way because that would mean a wider dialogue about contempt for black life in general. Young parents in Ghana, which happens to be one of the most peaceful countries in the world, despite being one of the most poorest, are not worried about their kids getting stabbed to death on the way to school. No. So clearly this is something specific, if we're talking about that psychological self-hatred element, to Britain and the United States and other places.
Carla, can I ask, because it was the particular point that Alex had made his really important intervention on, prison sentences and increased police presence and numbers. What effect might they have? On
reducing crime in the long term, virtually zero. A good friend of mine, Dr. Baz Dreisinger, did a study all around the world where she looked at prison systems and incarceration all around the world. She found not one country in which tougher sentences in and of themselves did anything to reduce crime. In fact, in many ways, we can just look across the water to the United States. They may make it worse for reasons that are entirely obvious. We already have the largest prison population in the whole of Western Europe.
I guess we don't hear this side of the coin enough. And it's very easy for us to sit here, look at a bunch of statistics and think that's the problem.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. I myself was the beneficiary of a Pan-African Saturday school tradition. So in post-war Britain, there were a whole tradition of essentially black Saturday schools, black-on-black education, if you will. And I was a beneficiary of that. Voices from that community and from that tradition have very rarely been heard. But coming back to the point you were making about sentencing, let's remember we've got a couple of centuries of this type of violent youth crime in predominantly white communities in Britain. What has led to reductions and solutions? At the turn of the 20th century in Manchester, it was intervention by church groups, it was intervention by community groups, it was ameliorative approaches, essentially. In Glasgow, the same thing has occurred recently in the last few years, yet we're being suggested the exact opposite policies that have been effective in British history and white communities, both at the turn of the 20th century in Manchester and recently in Glasgow. We should pursue exact opposite policies in London.
What would you say to a young black teenage boy in London right now who might be wandering around carrying a knife for self-protective reasons, whatever the reason may be, very specifically, well, what would you say to them?
It wouldn't be just to young black boys. As I said, it could be in Greater Manchester, it could be in Glasgow, it could be anywhere. There are a number of solutions. And I think mandatory self-defence in schools could be one of the solutions. Not because you would teach anyone to face down people carrying knives. You should run away with someone's carrying a knife. However, when you practice self-defence, it gives you a certain self-confidence. I work in schools a lot, and I see essentially good boys carrying knives out of fear. So I think that can be one of the solutions. I think support for the scores of already existing community groups that exist in the communities we talk a lot about, but not to. I think incentivising schools to reduce expulsions. We know that expulsion from school, that PRU trajectory is basically the beginning of the former head.
The exclusion then leads to the
former head of the prison service, Martin Neri, said when the 13,000 kids we expel from school, we may as well give them the prison sentence then and there. I'm not saying it's that simple. However, we could incentivise schools to reduce expulsions, looking at what the cost of the average expelled child costs the British taxpayer and spending that money to keep people in school. So there's a whole load of potential solutions beyond just saying to young people, hey, put down your knives. That
or we'll send you to prison.
Akala, we could talk to you a lot more about this. It's fascinating. I appreciate you coming on, giving us a very different side to this argument and an important side to the argument that should be taken seriously. So thank you very much.
Thank you.